There are love stories that feel like fairy tales, there are love stories that feel like nightmares, and then there are love stories that feel like someone took your beating heart, laid it gently on a table, and said, "Watch this," before carving it open in slow motion, and that, from the very first frame to the final lingering shot, is what Nyawa untuk Nyawamu dares to be. A 2025 Indonesian romantic melodrama that doesn't just ask what you would do for love, but what you would sacrifice, what you would break, and what you would willingly lose just so the person you care about can one day stand in the light without you. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments, because this is one of those movies you're going to want to talk about, unpack, and maybe even argue over long after the credits roll, and I want to know if you're watching this from Jakarta, from Kuala Lumpur, from Singapore, from New York, or maybe from some small room at 3 a.m. with your headphones on, trying not to cry too loud, because Nyawa untuk Nyawamu is that late-night kind of film, the kind of story that hits differently when the world is quiet and it's just you, your thoughts, and the echo of two hearts that can't quite let go of each other. Set a few years into an almost timeless urban Indonesia, the movie follows Nate, a young man slowly losing a private war against his own body, and Vivien, the woman who's ready to fight that war alongside him even when he decides to push her away as cruelly and as decisively as he can, not because he doesn't love her, but because he thinks loving her means stepping out of her future. That pretty much is the burning heart of the film. This paradox of love as both presence and absence, and from the beginning the movie sets up that emotional contract with us. You're not going to get an easy ride, you're not going to get pure sweetness, but you are going to get something that feels, at times, uncomfortably real. The background of this film's release already sets expectations high. 2025 has been a year where Southeast Asian cinema keeps experimenting with genre blends, and Nyawa untuk Nyawamu arrives at this crossroad between medical drama, romantic melodrama, and almost sci-fi-tinged ethical thriller, thanks to the experimental treatment angle. And yet it never fully slides into a laboratory story or a conspiracy story. It stays, stubbornly and almost obsessively, focused on Nate and Vivien, on what decisions look like when you are counting your remaining days like spare coins. It's the kind of film that you can imagine being pitched in one sentence. A terminally ill guy breaks up with his girlfriend to set her free, joins a risky treatment funded by a wealthy benefactor, disappears for 3 years, and then, when fate brings them back together at the edge of death, he still tries to reject her love, until, after being dragged through fire, they finally claim happiness together. It sounds almost straightforward when you put it like that, but the movie is all about the how, the in-between, the quiet spaces where people don't say what they mean, where they walk away even while wanting to run back. The story begins slow, not with a crash or a scream, but with this mundane, almost soft portrait of Nate and Vivien in better days, and that choice matters. We get to see them in little slices of normalcy, sharing jokes in a cafe, bickering about something tiny like wet umbrellas on the couch, Vivien tracing circles on Nate's wrist, not knowing those small gestures are going to haunt her later like ghosts. By the time we understand that Nate is sick, really sick, the film has already made sure we care, and it smartly doesn't drown us in medical jargon, sometimes just letting a single cough last a little too long, a held breath, a slow pan across pill bottles and folded hospital bills, and Vivien's smile faltering at the edges when she thinks he's not looking. Nate, in those early scenes, is written as that specific archetype, the man who grins through his fear, the one who cracks jokes in the doctor's waiting room, not because he's unaffected, but because that's how he protects others from the terror that's already clawing at him from the inside. And the director leans into that tension. You can feel that he's a ticking clock wrapped in denial. We watch as his illness becomes harder to hide, and Vivien, being more perceptive than he gives her credit for, starts feeling the distance even before he actively creates it. There's this heartbreaking dinner scene where she tries to talk about next year's plans, maybe a trip, maybe moving in together somewhere quieter, and Nate just stares at his food for a second too long before saying something vague like, "Let's not think that far ahead." And you can see in her eyes that she hears what he isn't saying. This is the foundation the film lays before it delivers the emotional punch, Nate's decision to push her away. When he does it, it's not in a noble, clean, cinematic way. It's messy, it's cruel. He picks a fight, he accuses her of not understanding him, of suffocating him, even of being better off with someone more stable, more successful, more alive, and Vivien, blindsided, just keeps asking, "What did I do? Tell me what I did," while he feeds her lies he thinks will set her free. The movie, to its credit, doesn't frame this immediately as romantic sacrifice. In the moment, it just feels like heartbreak, hurt, betrayal. We're not given the full extent of his medical condition right then. The script holds that back, allowing us to sit in Vivien's confusion and pain. She walks out, but not in anger. She stumbles out like someone whose entire reality just got rearranged without warning, and the camera follows her, keeping her slightly out of focus, like she can't even see herself clearly anymore. That's one of the strong suits of Nyawa untuk Nyawamu, the way it uses visuals, light, and distance to pull us into the emotional geography of these characters. We then follow Nate into the darker part of his journey, the decision to join an experimental treatment program, funded by some anonymous rich donor whose name floats around like myth in the hospital corridors. This is where the movie could have easily veered into cliché, the mysterious billionaire, the miracle cure, but instead it keeps the focus small. We see Nate alone in a sterile office, signing papers he barely reads, his signature slightly shaky, and outside the glass wall, life goes on, nurses walking by, families waiting. He is both inside and outside of life simultaneously. The donor figure, when introduced, is not some cartoonishly sinister villain but a polished, calm older man with kind eyes and a too-perfect suit, someone who speaks about pushing the boundaries of medicine and not being afraid of risk, with the ease of someone who knows he move on. It lets us feel that time stretch. We get fragments, Vivien trying to delete Nate's number and failing, Vivien attending a wedding of a friend and going quiet when everyone teases her about when it's her turn, Vivien walking by the places they used to go and pausing just for a second longer than necessary, like she's listening for a voice that doesn't come. We also see her grow in subtle ways. She gets a job promotion, she changes her haircut, she laughs more easily with co-workers, but in private, there's still that small shrine of the past, that drawer she hasn't opened, that photo she hasn't taken down. And then there's Nate, living in that liminal hospital world, going through procedures that are never fully explained, which is a smart narrative choice. We're not here for technical details, we're here for the cost. We watch him vomit in sinks, stare at ceilings, grip the railings of his hospital bed, sometimes lucid, sometimes drifting. The donor appears occasionally, almost like a patron saint of second chances, checking in on him, giving him this weird mixture of genuine concern and clinical detachment. The line between kindness and self-interest blurs, and you're left wondering, is Nate a person to this man, or a project? And so 3 years pass, and fate, in the way that only movies can orchestrate without feeling completely fake, brings Nate and Vivien back into each other's orbit. The way the film handles their reunion is one of its strongest sequences. It doesn't go for the cliché of bumping into each other in a supermarket aisle with spilled groceries everywhere. Instead, they see each other in a hospital, which is cruelly poetic. Vivien is there not for herself, but accompanying a friend or a family member, something that has nothing to do with Nate, and then she hears a voice, a laugh, something so familiar her body reacts before her mind does. The camera stays on her back as she turns, and there he is, Nate, thinner, paler, a bit older in the eyes, but alive. For a second, everything goes silent. No background crowd noise, no hospital beeps, just a close-up of her face as the realization lands, shock melting into disbelief, then this flood of anger and relief mixed together. You can almost hear her heartbeat. She calls his name, softly at first, then again louder, Nate, and he turns, but the moment their eyes meet, his expression doesn't light up, instead, it shutters. He looks afraid. This little detail is so good, we, the audience, screaming internally, run to her, you idiot, but he doesn't. He hesitates. You can see him calculating, building walls in real time. Vivien walks toward him, this mix of joy and hurt bubbling up, wanting answers, wanting to touch him just to confirm he's real. And then Nate does what Nate does best when he's terrified, he tries to push her away. He downplays everything, says the treatment is still ongoing, that it's complicated, that it was best she moved on, that she deserves more than being tied to someone whose life is basically one long medical chart. Every word that comes out of his mouth is coated in self-loathing. Vivien doesn't buy it this time. The earlier version of her might have broken, might have accepted his cruelty as truth, but 3 years of living with unanswered questions have given her a backbone of steel. She calls him out. You made that decision for me, she says, voice trembling but steady. You took away my choice, and now you want to do it again. There's such honesty in that line, because so many noble breakup stories ignore the selfishness involved in deciding what's best for someone else without letting them decide. Here, the movie finally names it. But even as Vivien leans into her anger, her love is still there, raw and obvious. She starts showing up, bringing him food, insisting on being present, chipping away at his defenses not with grand declarations, but with stubborn consistency. This is where the film takes a risk, slowing its pace down again to really live inside this awkward, painful reacquaintance. Some viewers might feel it drags, but there's intention here. Healing is not a montage, it's a grind. Nate alternates between letting her in and shutting her out. Some days, he laughs with her like old times, their chemistry crackling in those small, stolen moments like when they sneak up to the hospital rooftop and share a cheap instant coffee, squinting at the city lights, bantering about their worst past fashion choices, and on other days, he goes cold, refusing to pick up her calls, disappearing into tests and treatments, leaving her sitting in a plastic chair, clutching a paper cup, staring at a blank wall. Vivien, for her part, has to balance this with her own life, her responsibilities, the people around her who don't understand why she's digging up an old wound, why she refuses to move on. There's a particularly well-done argument between her and a close friend who says, "He left, Viv. He chose to leave. Don't romanticize it," and Vivien fires back, "You think I don't know that hurts? I live with it every day. But I saw the way he looked at me. People don't break like that if they don't love you." This line cuts to the thematic center of Nyawa untuk Nyawamu, love as both weapon and wound, as something that can justify terrible, hurtful choices while also being the only thing that can make surviving those choices feel worth it. The film never completely excuses Nate's decisions, instead, it lets us understand them while still holding him accountable. That's rare in melodrama, which often glorifies martyrdom. Meanwhile, the medical subplot simmers in the background. The experimental treatment has extended Nate's life, but it's not a magic cure. He lives in this suspended state, not dying today, but never fully safe, each new test result either a brief reprieve or another drop into fear. The wealthy donor continues to appear, sometimes with quiet pride, sometimes with a chilling hint of desperation, like he needs Nate's success to justify everything he's funded and everyone he's maybe failed before. There are whispers of other patients who weren't as lucky, hints of previous trials that went wrong, and the movie uses these to inject a subtle current of ethical unease underneath the romance. Are we supposed to cheer for the treatment because it gives Nate more time to love Vivien, or are we supposed to be unsettled by how lives become data points in someone else's ambition? This ambiguity gives the film extra weight. Visually, the director contrasts Nate's inner world with the living city outside. Hospital rooms are bathed in cold blues and whites. All hard surfaces and reflective glass, while scenes with Vivien out in the world are warmer, filled with sunlight filtering through cafe windows, street vendors calling out, motorbikes zipping past in a blur. When Vivien and Nate are together outside the hospital, the film leans into this warmth, but there's always something slightly off, a sudden coughing fit, a nosebleed, a faint shadow on an X-ray that we catch a glimpse of in the corner of the frame. We're never allowed to fully forget the ticking clock. Emotionally, the movie really finds its center in the middle act, where Vivien's struggle intensifies. She's fallen back into love with a man whose body is still a battlefield, and she has to confront the possibility that fighting for him might mean losing him all over again. There's a gut-wrenching scene where she sits alone in a chapel inside the hospital, not because she's particularly religious, but because it's the only quiet place she can find, and she whispers this half-angry, half-pleading monologue to no one in particular, admitting that she hates Nate for leaving, hates herself for still loving him, hates the universe for dangling him in front of her again, and yet, when she pictures walking away, it feels like killing him with her own hands. The camera just stays on her face, tears not dramatically streaming down, but just hanging there, unshed, like she's too tired to fully cry. It's such a restrained performance that hits hard precisely because it doesn't go overboard. And this is where we have to talk about the performances. The actor playing Nate pulls off a delicate balance. On the surface, he's quiet, even emotionally constipated at times, but under that, there's this restless ocean of guilt, fear, and longing. You see it in the way his eyes flicker when Vivien says she's not leaving again, in the way he grips the edge of his bedsheet when a doctor explains that his latest scans are inconclusive. He never becomes a passive victim of his illness. Paradoxically, his stubborn attempts to control his own exit from Vivien's life make him deeply active, even when what he's doing is pushing her away. On the other side, the actress playing Vivien is the film's beating heart, and the story knows it. She's allowed to be messy, irrational, fiercely loyal, and sometimes unbearably stubborn. In lesser hands, Vivien could have come across as clingy or self-sacrificing to the point of losing herself, but here, there's always this undercurrent of self-awareness. She knows what she's risking. When she tells Nate, "I'm not here because I don't have a life. I'm here because my life includes you," it's not said with naive devotion but with a firm, almost defiant clarity. The chemistry between the two is essential for a story like this, and they deliver. They have that lived-in feeling, like people who know the rhythm of each other's breathing, but also like strangers who missed out on 3 years of shared experiences. Their scenes oscillate between comfort and awkwardness in a way that feels painfully authentic. As the film moves into its final act, the stakes rise quietly but steadily. Nate's condition starts to deteriorate in ways that are hard to ignore. The donor pushes for one last, more aggressive procedure, the kind that might buy him more time but also might end his life on an operating table. Nate, once again, is tempted to make this decision alone, to spare Vivien another round of hospitals, but by this point, she's woven too deeply into his reality to be shut out. They argue, not the earlier kind of argument laced with lies, but a brutal, honest clash of fears and hopes. Nate admits that he's not just afraid of dying, he's afraid of surviving in a state where he's nothing but a burden, unable to be a partner, a lover, a man in the way he thinks a man should be. Vivien calls out that toxic pride for what it is, a story he's telling himself, a way of making his fear look noble. "You don't get to decide that my love is burdened," she says through gritted teeth. "You don't get to recast my choice as your guilt." It's so refreshing to hear a romantic lead articulate that. It cracks open the hero narrative and exposes the selfishness hidden underneath the supposed sacrifice. Parallel to this, there's a quiet subplot with another patient, a teenage boy who befriends Nate in the ward, full of questions and crude jokes, someone who hasn't yet learned how to put armor on his fear. His presence gives Nate a mirror. Here's someone who doesn't have a lover to push away, who doesn't have a 3-year heartbreak trailing behind him, and yet he's just as fragile. There's a scene where they talk about what they'd do if they had guaranteed time, 5 years, 10 years, and Nate instinctively starts listing things with Vivien in mind, then stops, realizing he's still building his future around her in his head even while trying to cut her out of it. That self-contradiction is beautifully human. Now, in terms of pacing, some might argue the movie lingers too long in monologues, but if you surrender to it, it feels almost like reading a long, emotional letter from two people who can't stop circling the same wounds, trying to find new angles of understanding. It's indulgent, yes, but that's the genre. This is romantic melodrama, not a brisk thriller. The cinematography also leans into its own brand of poetry, lots of reflections, characters separated by panes of glass, conversations happening with one person in focus and the other blurred, as if they are never quite inhabiting the same reality at the same time. Lighting shifts subtly. Hospital corridors at night are shot like liminal tunnels, while daytime scenes outdoors are almost overexposed, the sunlight too bright, as if happiness, when it shows up, is something the characters have to squint against. Sound design works quietly but effectively, with certain recurring motifs, the beeping of a heart monitor morphing into the ticking of a clock, a favorite song of Nate and Vivien's that we hear diegetically early on, then only as faint memory are instrumented later, like an echo. As for themes, Nyawa untuk Nyawamu isn't content with just saying, love conquers all. In fact, for most of its runtime, it suggests that love is not a cure, it doesn't halt disease, it doesn't rewrite medical reports. What it does is give those reports context, give the suffering and the fear a sense of connection. It also wrestles with the idea of agency, who gets to make life and death decisions, and for whom. Nate initially takes that agency entirely upon himself, framing it as protection, but the movie gradually deconstructs that and shows how shared burdens, while heavier in some ways, are also more honest. There's also the socio-economic layer peeking at us through the donor subplot. The experimental treatment is expensive, exclusive, and morally ambiguous. The rich donor is framed neither as a savior nor a devil, but as someone playing God in a system that already values some lives over others. When he and Vivien finally collide in a late-scene confrontation, she challenges him, asking whether he sees people like Nate as proof of his success, and his answer is evasive, cloaked in the language of progress. It's a powerful moment because the film doesn't give us the catharsis of him breaking down in guilt. Instead, he out because it's not afraid to be earnest, to be heavy. It taps into very real fears that many families in Indonesia and beyond deal with: catastrophic illness, unaffordable treatments, the burden of caregiving, and the emotional calculus of staying or leaving. For viewers who've sat by hospital beds, who've watched someone they love struggle with treatments that promise everything and guarantee nothing, this movie is going to feel almost too close. There are moments when it might trigger memories you're not ready to unpack. And yet, for that very reason, it also has the potential to be cathartic. I can imagine people coming out of the theater with red eyes, texting someone they haven't spoken to in years, or simply sitting in the parking lot for a while, letting their own unresolved stories surface. Among younger audiences, especially those who have grown up in a culture saturated with shorter, snappier content, 2025 film that dares to take its time, to slow burn its drama with almost old-fashioned sincerity, might feel refreshing or, for some, frustrating. But the emotional core is universal: feeling like a burden, fearing abandonment, wrestling with whether you're allowed to want something beautiful in the face of your own fragility. On social media, I can already picture the discourse: people debating whether Nate's decision to leave was ever truly justifiable, people arguing about Vivien's choices, whether she should have walked away after being hurt so deeply. Some will romanticize their pain, others will call out the unhealthy patterns in their dynamic. And that's good. That means the film has done its job: it has sparked conversation instead of just sliding past as disposable entertainment. Did Nyawa untuk Nyawamu reinvent the wheel in terms of plot? No. You can trace its narrative DNA to classic weepy romances and terminal illness dramas across decades of cinema. But where it earns its place is in the details: the quiet pauses, the awareness of social realities, the refusal to make its characters flawless martyrs. When Nate, near the end, finally breaks down and admits to Vivien that he's tired of being brave, tired of pretending his choices are for her when really they are for his own fear, it feels like a genuine moment of growth. He lets himself be seen not as a tragic hero, but as an imperfect man who's been running away from vulnerability. And that's the turning point. Because only when he stops trying to be noble alone can they actually be honest together. The final sequences of the film are carefully calculated to completely wreck you and then slowly put you back together. Without revealing every single visual beat, it's safe to say that the movie doesn't cop out with an overly tidy miracle. Nate's health doesn't magically reset. The experimental treatment gives him a fighting chance, but not a guarantee. The real victory is not in him standing up from a wheelchair in a cheesy final shot, but in him finally letting Vivien stand beside him, fully, without pushing her away under the guise of protection. There's a beautifully shot scene near the end where they sit outside, away from the hospital at last, on a quiet hillside or a small seaside overlook depending on your reading of the visuals, the wind playing with Vivien's hair as she rests her head on his shoulder. They talk not about forever, but about tomorrow, and next week, about small, tangible things, like what dish they want to cook together, what plant she wants to buy for their future living room. It's so simple, yet it feels monumental because up to this point, Nate hasn't been able to imagine even the near future with her without adding an asterisk of doom. Now, he's learning to live in that uncertain happiness, and in a way, that's the film's thesis, that two souls tested by fate don't achieve happiness by defeating mortality, but by choosing joy and connection even under its shadow. From a purely cinematic perspective, the director opts for an ending that is more of a soft landing than a dramatic crescendo. There's no big applause moment, no sweeping kiss in the rain. Instead, we're left with something quieter, an afterglow, like the lingering warmth after a storm has finally moved on. Some may crave a more explosive finale, but I think this restraint is what elevates the film. It honors the journey we've taken by not insulting it with false neatness. If there's any criticism to be leveled here, it might be that the movie sometimes luxuriates too long in its own sadness. There are sequences where you feel the weight of its runtime, where another teary conversation threatens to push you from empathy into exhaustion. A tighter edit in a few places could have preserved all the emotional beats while keeping the momentum stronger. Additionally, while the donor subplot adds thematic richness, it occasionally feels underdeveloped compared to the central romance. Some viewers might wish for a bit more digging into his backstory or into the wider consequences of his medical empire. But to be clear, these are small cracks in an otherwise very solid emotional structure. What lingers after the credits is not the technical quibbles, it's the images of Vivien's hand firmly gripping Nate's when he tries to pull away, the sound of his laugh when, for a rare moment, he forgets his supposed to be tragic, the echo of that 3-year gap hanging over every word they speak to each other. Nyawa untuk Nyawamu joins a long tradition of tragic and near-tragic romances, but it carves its own space by being very specifically rooted in its cultural and emotional context. It doesn't universalize in a bland way, it invites you into its world, into its hospitals and street corners and cramped apartments, and trusts that if it tells this one story truthfully enough, you'll find yourself somewhere in it regardless of where you're watching from. In the end, when we think about films like this, what we remember aren't the exact plot points, but the feelings they left us with. Did we feel seen? Did we feel challenged? Did we feel that ache in the throat, the urge to call someone afterward and say, "Hey, I know we don't talk about this often, but I'm scared of losing you"? Nyawa untuk Nyawamu has the power to leave that kind of echo. It's not about perfect people making perfect sacrifices, it's about two flawed souls, one who's afraid his love is a burden, and one who refuses to let fear dictate the terms of her heart, stumbling toward a fragile, hard-earned happiness. And in a world that constantly tells us to only show our best, healthiest, most filtered selves, seeing a story where love persists in sickness, in fear, in doubt, is strangely, fiercely hopeful. So if you're thinking about watching this film, be prepared, it will ask you to sit with discomfort, to watch a man make choices you might hate and a woman make choices you might not understand, and it won't always rush to reassure you. But if you let it, it will also remind you that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay when running away would be easier, to open your heart where closing it would hurt less in the short term. Nyawa untuk Nyawamu isn't a flawless film, but it is an honest one, and in the crowded landscape of 2025 cinema, that honesty might be exactly what makes it worth your time, your tears, and maybe even your own little bit of healing as you watch two lives, two souls tested by fate, finally choose to walk forward together, not because the future is guaranteed, but because, for once, they are willing to face it side by side. There is a moment in Nyawa untuk Nyawamu where the camera just sits on Nate's face as he watches the woman he loves walk away, pretending he doesn't care, pretending that this is what he wants, while everything in his eyes is screaming the opposite, and it's in that silence, in that tiny betrayal of his own heart, that this film stopped being just another tragic romance for me and became something heavier, something that feels like it's asking, how far would you go to save the person you love? From yourself, from your own broken body, from the future you think they deserve more than you, and how wrong can you be when you try to play God with someone else's happiness? Nyawa untuk Nyawamu, which roughly translates to A Life for Your Life, is a 2025 Indonesian romantic drama that dresses itself like a familiar illness melodrama, but underneath that, there's a surprisingly layered story about sacrifice, guilt, stubborn love, and the cruel, beautiful way time keeps moving forward no matter how much you beg it to stop. Before I dive deep into this movie, into the way it wrecked me and then gently put me back together, I want you to settle into this question. Have you ever had someone push you away and you only realized years later they were doing it because they thought it was the only way to protect you? And if you had the chance to go back, would you forgive them? Sit with that. Because this whole film is basically that one question stretched across 2 souls and 3 years. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. I know, this is technically a gaming channel, but around here we don't just talk about bosses and loot drops, we talk about stories, and sometimes the most brutal boss fights are the ones that happen in hospital corridors and inside your own chest. So if you're into games, storytelling, or just getting your heart shattered and glued back together again by cinema, you're in the right place. And now let's talk about Nate and Vivien. So, Nyawa untuk Nyawamu came out in 2025, and on paper it sounds like the kind of thing you've maybe seen before. A young man, Nate, is seriously ill. His girlfriend Vivien has a bright future ahead of her, and instead of holding on to her, he decides to push her away, to make sure she's not tied to a dying man. He volunteers for an experimental treatment funded by a rich donor, vanishes from her life, and then 3 years later fate throws them back together, right at the edge of his mortality again. But the way this film tells that story is what makes it special. it doesn't rush to the tragedy, it lingers in the small, quiet, ordinary moments of love that make the later heartbreak actually hurt. The director, instead of going big and flashy, goes intimate, almost invasive, like we're eavesdropping on conversations we're not supposed to hear. And the performances are tuned to that same frequency, grounded and raw. The film opens not with hospital beeps or a diagnosis scene but with Nate and Vivien on a motorbike, weaving through the streets of Jakarta at night, wind cutting through their laughter, neon lights streaking across the visor of Nate's helmet, and there's this playful argument about which warrant has the best seat. You can hear the traffic, the muffled honks, you can see the cheap plastic chairs stacked at the side of the road, and for a few minutes, Nyawa untuk Nyawamu feels like a simple slice-of-life romance, two young people, broke but happy, clutching a few hours of freedom between work shifts and responsibilities. The dialogues are loose, overlapping, the camera feels handheld and just a little unsteady, giving everything this documentary-like immediacy, and you immediately buy them as a couple because the chemistry isn't the idealized movie kind, it's messy, affectionate, familiar. He teases her about always over-planning, she mocks him for never finishing his freelance projects on time, and the very first foreshadowing of his illness is not some dramatic coughing blood into a tissue, it's just a tiny moment where he stops halfway up a staircase, hides his shortness of breath as a joke, and she flicks his forehead, telling him to hit the gym. The film is already planting seeds in your brain without you even noticing, and that's the thing I really appreciate. It trusts you, as a viewer, to pick up on the details instead of screaming every emotion at you. Then, after that warm, lived-in intro, the movie pulls the rug slowly, gently. We see Nate at a clinic, alone, under harsh white lighting. That soft, grainy warmth of the opening scenes has completely drained away. He listens to the doctor talk about his condition, something degenerative and cruel that's been silently chipping away at his body. And what I like here is that the script doesn't over-explain the medical jargon, because that's not the point. The point is how the words land on Nate's face. The camera stays on him in a medium close-up while the doctor's voice becomes this distant, slightly blurred sound, like what you hear when you're underwater and someone's talking from outside the pool. We get snippets: heart, progressive, complications, limited options, transplant wait list, experimental therapy, no guarantees, and in that moment you understand that the film isn't just going to be about romance, it's about what it means to be told your days are now counted. What would you do if suddenly the timeline of your life shrank? Who would you try to protect? Who would you selfishly cling to? Almost immediately, Nate's mind goes to Vivien, and that's where the title starts quietly echoing beneath everything. At this point in the story, we don't know that he's going to push her away, but we can already see that he's the kind of person who carries other people's burdens like they are his own. Later that night, there's this hauntingly beautiful scene of Nate lying awake next to Vivien as she sleeps, light from a passing train rhythmically flickering across their small rented room, her acceptance letter to an overseas graduate program half tucked under the pillow because she fell asleep reading it. The camera moves slowly from the letter to her face, then to his, and you see that mix of pride and terror, like he's realizing in real time that maybe the best thing he can do for her is disappear. This is one of those subtle touches that hit me. Vivien doesn't even know yet that she's the reason he's about to break his own heart. She thinks their life is just starting, but in his mind, he's already rehearsing his exit. And I think that's the emotional hook of this entire film. It puts you inside the head of someone who loves so ferociously that he mistakes his own absence as a gift. Now, before I go deeper into the plot, let's talk a bit about the craft here, because Nyawa untuk Nyawamu is clearly made with a lot of intention. The color palette in the early parts, especially the scenes of Nate and Vivien just being a couple, sharing cheap meals, studying together, joking about future travel plans, is filled with warm yellows and soft, almost nostalgic lighting, like you're looking at slightly faded photographs. The sound design layers in little bits of city life, the distant call to prayer, a vendor shouting, the occasional train rumble, grounding the romance in a very specific Indonesian reality. And then, without you noticing the exact moment it happens, as Nate's illness becomes a bigger part of the story, the colors shift towards cooler blues and clinical whites. The frame feels emptier, and even the background noises get toned down, leaving you with a lot more silence, as if his world is shrinking. That's one of the cinematic strengths of the film. It uses visuals and sound to mirror the emotional arc, not in a flashy, look at me way, but in a way you only realize in hindsight. So at this point, let me warn you, from here on I'm going into spoiler territory, because to really talk about why this film hit as hard as it did, I need to unpack the choices these characters make and the way the story twists the knife and then offers you a hand. If you want to go into Nyawa untuk Nyawamu completely blind, maybe pause here, go watch it, and then come back. But if you're okay with walking through the entire emotional gauntlet with me, let's keep going. The big turning point in the first act is, of course, the breakup. But what the film does that elevates it is the slow build up to that moment. Nate doesn't wake up one day and randomly decide to end things. Instead, we see him pulled in multiple directions. There's the doctor, offering a clinical trial funded by a mysterious donor, Adrian Wirawan, a wealthy philanthropist whose name is on half the hospital wing. There's his mother, Ibu Rini, quietly terrified but trying to be strong, pressing prayer beads into his hand. There's his own sense of masculine pride, this ingrained belief that being a burden makes him less of a man. And then there's Vivien, so full of dreams and plans, talking about how in 3 years she'll maybe be working in architecture projects abroad and he'll be selling his art online, and they'll finally have money to move into a better flat. Every time she says, 3 years from now, you see Nate flinch just a little. Time, for him, is no longer this open horizon, it's a cliff edge. The film does something really smart with repetitions. Vivien keeps saying, Nanti, later, someday, and those words slowly twist into a kind of poison for Nate. How do you tell someone their laters might never come? So instead of telling her, he chooses deception. The breakup scene happens in the most uncinematic of places, which is exactly why it hits, a crowded, slightly noisy food court in a mall, fluorescent lights humming, a pop song playing faintly in the background. He picks that spot not because it's romantic but because it's public, because it'll be harder for him to break down, harder for her to cause a scene, so he can keep control. You can see from the start that something's off. He's unusually calm, his smile a little too fixed, his joke slightly forced. The camera keeps cutting to Vivien's fingers nervously tracing the rim of her drink, like her body knows something is wrong before her mind does. And then he drops it. He tells her he doesn't see a future with her, that he's bored, that maybe they were just clinging to each other because it was convenient. The words are cruel, carefully chosen to stab, and you can see in his eyes he hates himself for every syllable. She laughs at first, thinking it's a joke, but when he goes on, when he mentions some random girl from his office that he's apparently been seeing, her face just empties out. There's no dramatic slap, no thrown drink. Instead, there's this deep, wounded stillness, the kind where your brain is trying to reboot because your reality just got rewritten. She stands up, says in this small voice, if you wanted to hurt me, you didn't have to lie this much, and walks away. The camera stays on Nate as she disappears into the crowd, and the food court noise just gradually fades, leaving only the sound of his breathing. He doesn't run after her, he doesn't call her name. He just sits there, knuckles white around his plastic cup, and that's the moment you fully understand. His love for her is so twisted by fear that he thinks breaking her now is better than letting her stay and break more slowly. From there, the film throws us into the second major thread, the experimental treatment. Adrian Wirawan, the donor, is introduced not as a cartoonish rich villain but as this slightly enigmatic, soft-spoken older man who visits the hospital with no entourage, just a simple batik shirt and tired eyes. He tells Nate that the clinical trial he's funding is risky but promising, a cutting-edge attempt to repair and regenerate damaged heart tissue using an experimental therapy. Nate asks, how much does it cost? And Adrian just looks at him, almost offended, and says, your life is not something you should have to buy, it's something we should all protect. And at first, Adrian feels like a savior. If you've grown up in a world where money decides who gets treatment and who doesn't, the idea of someone just giving you a chance at life feels almost miraculous. But the movie is clever. It doesn't let you rest in that comfort. There are conditions. The treatment requires full commitment, months, maybe years, in a special facility, tightly controlled. No outside contact during the early phases, absolute secrecy to protect the integrity of the trial. You can feel the weight of that offer. It's like being told you can maybe live, but you have to die socially for a while. Nate looks at his mother, looks at the pamphlet, looks at the door through which Vivien might have walked if this scene had happened 1 week earlier, and he says yes. The screenplay doesn't dwell too long on the logistics. We get a montage of hospital prep, of Nate signing papers he barely reads, of Ibu Rini crying quietly in the corridor, of Adrian watching them with that inscrutable, almost guilty expression. The music here pulls back, giving space to the natural sounds, paper rustling, pen scratching, rubber soles on tile, underscoring how cold and transactional survival can sometimes feel. Then the film does something bold. It jumps forward, 3 years, title card, simple white text on a black screen, Tiga Tahin comedian, and suddenly we're not with Nate anymore, we're with Vivien. This structural choice is one of the things I loved most. Instead of hanging with Nate through his treatment, through the SCIFI adjacent medical procedures, the film leaves that largely off-screen and focuses on the cost his choice had on the person he left behind. We see Vivien in a different city, older, sharper around the edges. In an office full of architectural models and blueprints, she's giving a presentation to clients, confident, poised, and successful. Her colleagues tease her about never dating, about being married to her work, and she just shrugs it off. There's a bitter humor when she says, "I already used up my lifetime quota of heartbreak," and they laugh, not knowing how literal that feels for her. We see her return to Jakarta for a project, and this is where fate, or scriptwriting convenience if you're cynical, starts weaving the two characters back toward each other. But the film handles it with enough emotional groundwork that it doesn't feel like a cheap coincidence. Vivien's project involves designing a community health center funded by, guess who, the Adrian Wirawan Foundation. She doesn't know that name yet, but the audience does, and that creates this quiet tension. Somewhere in the same web of philanthropy and medicine, Nate is alive, and we're just waiting for the collision. The first glimpse we get of Nate in the present day is almost surreal. Vivien is at the groundbreaking ceremony of the clinic, politely bored, making small talk with officials, when her attention is caught by a man across the courtyard helping an elderly woman who almost trips. The camera does that thing where everyone else blurs a little as it pushes in on his face. Time slows, she squints, his hair is shorter now, there are faint scars peeking out from the collar of his shirt, and his posture is different, more careful somehow. But it's him. Her hand tightens around the folder she's holding, knuckles pale. She whispers his name like a prayer, Nate, and the sound seems to bounce around in her own head. The film doesn't give us an instant romantic reunion. Instead, there's confusion, anger, and disbelief. Didn't he leave? Wasn't he done with her? And now he's just here, at this event, breathing the same air, acting like life just went on. She marches across the courtyard, pulse pounding in the sound mix. We actually hear her heartbeat, a nice little ironic touch. But before she reaches him, Adrian steps in, introducing Nate to some other guests, calling him one of their first success stories. That phrase, success story, lands so weirdly. It's like Nate has become a case study instead of a person. Vivien stops a few meters away, just watching. Nate laughs politely at something Adrian says, and for a split second, their eyes meet. I love this shot. The camera stays at a distance, as if we're spying from behind a pillar. The sound drops out almost completely, and we only hear a faint ringing, like when a grenade goes off in war movies. His eyes widen just a little, then his expression shutters, like a door slamming shut behind them. He looks away, he pretends she's just another random guest, and in that moment, you get your second confirmation of the film's thesis. He is going to keep choosing what he thinks is best for her, even if it's the last thing she wants. From there, the movie shifts into this delicate dance between denial and longing. Vivien, who spent 3 years convincing herself to move on, suddenly has living proof that her pain wasn't just a phase, that he didn't move cities, he didn't start a new life without her, he was fighting for his own. But she's furious that he never told her, furious that he let her imagine the worst while he quietly clung to hope somewhere else. There's a confrontational energy building under every encounter. The second time they meet properly, it's in a hospital corridor, because of course, so much of this film happens in hallways where lives pivot, and she corners him. No polite smiles now, she cuts straight in. You died for me without dying. You disappeared. Was it really easier to let me think you stopped loving me than to let me decide for myself? And he, stubborn, damaged Nate, just absorbs that anger like it's his punishment. He tells her in this detached voice that the trial required isolation, that it was complicated, that he didn't want to disturb her new life. He keeps using words like disturb, burden, trouble, as if his mere existence is something she needs to be protected from. We slowly learn more about what happened during those 3 years through small, fragmented flashbacks, woven into the present-day conversation. They are not full scenes, just flashes. Nate lying in a sterile room, chest wired to machines, Adrian watching through glass, Nate vomiting after a harsh round of treatment, a nurse telling him his Heart function is improving. Nights where he stares at the blank wall, imagining Vivien's face in the patterns of light, Adrian sitting at his bedside, telling him stories about other patients who didn't make it. These glimpses paint a picture of someone who has been living so close to death for so long that he's convinced everything good must be temporary, especially love. Here's where the theme of the title really surfaces. Nyawa untuk Nyawamu is not just about Nate giving up his life for Vivien's future. It's also about the way Adrian uses his wealth and influence, trading his money and security for the possibility of extending other people's lives. But with moral compromises attached, we gradually learn that the trial, while technically saving Nate, has left his body in a precarious state. His heart works, but it's fragile, full of scar tissue, like glue holding a broken vase. The doctors warn him that while the experimental therapy bought him time, it also means that any further deterioration might be rapid and irreversible. He is, essentially, living on borrowed time, and he knows it intimately. That knowledge has warped his idea of what a good life is. Rather than reaching for what he wants, he's content to just be grateful he can walk, breathe, climb stairs slowly. He doesn't dare risk pain again, especially not Vivien's. But Vivien, standing in front of him in that corridor, hair pulled back in a practical bun, still wearing the necklace he once gave her, is not having it. And this is one of the reasons I love her character. She refuses to be reduced to a symbol of future or burden. She insists on her agency. She tells him, "You don't get to decide that my life is better without you. You don't get to be the hero of a story where I'm the excuse." And that line it hits. The performance from the actress here is incredible. Her voice shakes, but not from weakness. It's like a controlled burn, and you can see the tears in her eyes, but she doesn't let them fall yet. The cinematography mirrors this dynamic shift. For the first time since the time skip, the camera frames Vivien slightly higher, giving her the power in the frame, while Nate is often shot from the side, half in shadow. He's the one hiding. She's the one stepping into the full, harsh hospital light. The second act of the film is basically a series of emotional skirmishes between them. Sometimes they bump into each other at the clinic project site, forced into small talk by circumstances. Sometimes they have accidental moments of softness, like when they get caught in the rain and duck under the same awning, their shoulders almost touching but not quite. In those scenes, the film calms down, lets them remember how to exist in the same space without yelling. They share memories, the bus route they used to take, the songs they used to sing off-key, and through those, we understand that for all his self-sacrificial nonsense, Nate does still love her, deeply, constantly. The kind of love that never turned off even when he tried to smother it, but just when you think they might find a way back. The story twists the knife again. We find out that Nate has been hiding something even bigger than the original breakup. The experimental treatment is failing. Subtle hints were planted earlier. A wince when he climbs stairs, a hand pressed against his chest in the mirror, a too long pause when the doctor asks about his symptoms. But now it's confirmed. Dr. Sari, the physician supervising his case, tells him the latest tests show deterioration. His heart is approaching a point where standard transplant options are unlikely, and the only potential way to buy more time is an even riskier phase of the trial, something Adrian is pushing for because the data would be invaluable. This is where the ethical tension deepens. Adrian frames it as, "You've already come this far, Nate. Your case could pave the way for countless others. Your suffering could mean someone else never has to go through this." And for a man like Nate, who has built his identity around not being useless, not being a wait, that's a seductive argument. If he can't give Vivien a future, maybe he can at least give the world something. But in practical terms, what Adrian is really asking is another version of the title, your life for other lives. It's a trade, a sacrifice dressed as opportunity. And the film doesn't paint Adrian as purely predatory. You can see genuine conviction in him, real grief for the patients he's lost. There's a powerful quiet scene where he sits alone in an empty ward, the camera lingering on the way he runs his hand over discarded hospital bracelets, and you sense that this whole philanthropy empire he's built is his way of appeasing some ghost he can't outrun. But good intentions don't erase the pressure he puts on Nate, and the script doesn't let him off the hook. So now Nate is cornered. His body is a ticking clock, his love has re-entered his life, and he's being told that his dying can have a purpose beyond himself. Naturally, what does he do? He tries to push Vivien away again, and if you're watching this, you're probably like, "Dude, come on, we just went through this." And that's exactly what Vivien expresses too. When she finally learns the truth about his condition worsening, after barging into Dr. Sari's office and demanding answers, which is one of those cathartic scenes where she weaponizes her rational, professional calm to fight against a system that would rather keep family and lovers conveniently uninformed. She storms into Nate's apartment, which is this tiny, sparsely decorated place with medical bills and trial documents scattered on a desk, and they have the fight that has been 3 years in the making. This fight, for me, is the emotional core of the movie. It's not pretty, it's not poetic, it's raw, messy, overlapping dialogue, accusations, confessions. She calls him a coward for deciding her future without her. He calls himself realistic, tells her that loving him is like building a house on an earthquake fault line. She throws his own words back at him from years ago, the lies he told in that food court. It's like they're emptying a junk drawer of all the resentment and love they've stuffed away. The camera barely cuts, holding on a wide shot of them pacing, sitting, standing, pacing again. It feels theatrical, like we're watching a stage play, and that's intentional. The director trusts the actors to carry the scene without fancy edits. In the middle of the screaming, there's this sudden quiet when Nate finally cracks and admits the truth that has been poisoning him. If I let you stay, if I let myself be happy with you, and then I die on you, how am I supposed to forgive myself for making you watch me disappear by inches? I can't do that to you. I love you too much to let you see me like that. And Vivien just stares at him, tears finally spilling over, and says this line that has stayed with me ever since I watched it. You don't get to protect me from my own heart, if I choose to sit beside you while you're dying. That's my life, that's my decision. Loving you isn't a burden, it's my choice. Stop stealing my choices. That's when it really clicked for me how smart this script is. So many stories about terminal illness romanticize the idea of the sick person nobly letting their lover go for their own good, but Nyawa untuk Nyawamu calls that out. It says, maybe that's not nobility, maybe that's fear wearing a hero's costume, maybe real courage is staying, letting someone love you at your weakest, trusting them enough to bear that pain with you. After that confrontation, the dynamic between them shifts. Nate can't unhear her words, and Vivien, for all her anger, is not a saint. She struggles with the reality of what it would mean to stay. The film is very honest about that. We get a heartbreaking montage of her going through the motions of everyday life, designing buildings, attending meetings, while her mind replays worst-case scenarios of Nate collapsing, of hospital rooms, of funerals. Her friend Mia calls her out gently, reminding her that love is always a gamble, even with healthy people. We just don't see the cards as clearly. And that's one of the film's thematic strengths. It universalizes the specific. You may not be in love with someone who has a failing heart, but everyone loves someone who is mortal. Everyone is making a bet with pain when they let someone in. Eventually, Vivien makes a decision. She will not run. The next time she sees Nate, she doesn't ask permission, she doesn't negotiate, she just shows up at his checkups, brings food to his apartment, forces him to accept the reality that she's in this, whether he thinks it's smart or not. There's a tender scene where she helps him change the dressing on his chest scar, and you can see how vulnerable he feels letting her see him like that, how much it costs him to drop the performance of being fine. The camera stays close, capturing the tremor in his hands, the way she concentrates on the task, not making a big deal of it, normalizing his brokenness. It's deeply intimate without being sexual, and slowly, he starts to soften. We see glimpses of the old Nate, his lame jokes, his habit of sketching caricatures of people in waiting rooms, peek through the layers of fear. For a brief stretch, the film lets us breathe with them. There are sequences of them revisiting old haunts. The motorbike ride returns, slower this time, with him holding on more carefully. They sit by the train tracks watching the city lights, talking about hypothetical futures they know they might never reach. But this time there's no lying, no false promises, just honesty. Vivien asks him what he wants, not what he thinks he should choose, and he finally admits, quietly, I want more time, I want boring days with you, I want to argue about stupid things like which show to watch, I want to live, even if it's short, I'm just scared. And she squeezes his hand, and for once, that's enough. They don't need a grand plan. But of course, this is a film, and we're not done suffering. Adrian re-enters the story with a proposition. The next phase of the trial is ready, and Nate is the ideal candidate. The risk is high, but if it works, it could stabilize his condition for several more years. If it fails, it could accelerate the collapse. Nate, always the one to shoulder responsibility, feels the pull. He sees it as his way of ensuring Vivien doesn't have to watch a slow, drawn-out decline. It's a high-stakes gamble. Either he gets more time with her, or he burns out quickly and spares her the prolonged agony. And led into that is Adrian's pressure about the data being invaluable for future patients. It's that classic ethical dilemma wrapped in personal stakes. Vivien is understandably against it. She doesn't want him to turn himself into a guinea pig yet again just because someone with money thinks it's noble. There's a heated three-way confrontation in Adrian's sleek office, glass walls, city skyline outside, the physical embodiment of power and distance, where Vivien accuses Adrian of exploiting Nate's survivor's guilt, of dangling hope in front of desperate people in exchange for their bodies. Adrian, for his part, insists that he's offering choices, not forcing anything, and that doing nothing is its own form of cruelty. The script doesn't give easy answers here. It lets all three perspectives be understandable, even when you disagree. What tips the balance is something small. Nate overhears a conversation between Adrian and Dr. Sari about another patient, a teenager, who died in an earlier phase of the trial. Adrian is shaken, but he's already reframing it as necessary loss, and you can see something fracture in Nate. He realizes that in Adrian's narrative, he is both subject and statistic, both human being and line item in a study. His death, if it happens, will be mourned, yes, but also cited in journals, and that unsettles him. When he goes home that night, he has a quiet scene with his mother, who has been mostly in the background, praying, cooking, hovering. She finally speaks up, tells him that she has spent years bargaining with God to keep him alive, but that's not the same as wanting him to turn his life into a constant experiment. She says something like, if all your days are spent in rooms with machines, signing forms and gambling with your blood, when do you actually live? When do you get to just be my son, or her boyfriend, or just Nate? And that lands. It reframes the question from how do I die usefully to how do I live meaningfully? And it's in this space that Vivien's influence really blooms, because she doesn't just love him passively, she challenges him, pulls him towards life, not martyrdom. Together, they come up with what feels like a small rebellion. Nate decides to say no to the new trial, at least for now, to ask for palliative support and targeted, less invasive treatments, and focus on quality of time instead of bargaining for theoretical extra years. At any cost, telling Adrian this, in a quiet scene at the hospital rooftop, is one of the most satisfying moments in the film. Nate, once timid and grateful to a fault, now stands up, looks Adrian in the eye, and thanks him genuinely for saving his life once, but firmly declines to be saved again on terms that turn him into an instrument. Adrian is hurt, maybe a little offended, but he also respects the choice. In an unspoken way, it forces him to confront his own savior complex. The rooftop setting, open sky above, the city humming below, visually represents this shift from enclosed, clinical control to messy, unpredictable freedom. From there, the film glides into its final act, which is less about big plot twists and more about emotional resolution. We watch Nate and Vivien actually inhabit the choice they've made, to be together, fully, in whatever time they have. There's a montage of mundane intimacy that quietly wrecked me, them brushing teeth side by side, him falling asleep with his head in her lap while she works on her laptop, her learning the rhythm of his medications, him recording little video messages for her to watch, just in case, but also maybe just to preserve the sound of his voice. There's a picnic scene in a small park where he gets tired halfway through eating and she doesn't freak out. She just lets him rest his head on her shoulder, and they sit in silence. You can feel that their love has matured from something idealistic and future-focused into something grounded in the present. And that's what I think the film ultimately wants to say. That love is not just about promises of forever, it's about choosing each other again and again in the face of uncertainty. But this is not some neat fairy tale where illness magically disappears. Nate's condition continues to be precarious. There are nights where his chest pain brings them both to the edge of panic, mornings where he has to cancel plans because he simply doesn't have the strength. The film doesn't shy away from showing the toll that takes on both of them. Vivien has moments of frustration, of exhaustion. There's a small, sharp scene where she snaps at him for misplacing his pills, then instantly regrets it, and he, instead of wallowing, just hugs her and says, "It's okay to be tired. I'm tired too." And they laugh through tears. That kind of honesty is rare in melodramas that usually paint the caregiver as endlessly patient. What about the ending, though? How do you wrap up a story that has been about death slowly circling its prey without either going full tragedy or cheap miracle? Nyawa untuk Nyawamu threads that needle by choosing an ending that is hopeful without being dishonest. There is no last-minute transplant, no sudden miracle cure discovered in a lab. Instead, we get a time jump again, but this one is gentler. The screen fades, and when it opens, we see Nate and Vivien a couple of years down the line, older, but not ridiculously so. He walks with a slight limp, carries a small oxygen concentrator in a backpack, but he's walking. They've opened a small community art and counseling center next to the clinic she designed, a place for patients and families to gather, to process, to create. We watch them help a young couple going through a similar diagnosis, sharing what they've learned, offering not false hope but companionship. In one quiet scene, Nate sits with a teenage boy tethered to an 4 and says, "I don't know how long any of us have. Doctors can guess, but they don't know. What I do know is that the time feels different when you stop counting how much is left and start counting what you can fill it with." And that feels like the thesis statement of his whole journey. The final minutes of the film give us one more scare. Nate has a collapse at the center, and there's a frantic rush to the hospital. But instead of turning it into the big, tragic death scene, the film cuts from the chaos to a soft shot of him waking up later, in a hospital room, alive, Vivien asleep in a chair by his bed, her hand still gripping his. He watches her, smiles tiredly, and whispers, "You stayed," like he still can't quite believe it. She stirs, wakes, and replies, half annoyed, "Where else would I go?" And they share this small, weary, beautiful laugh. There's no promise that he'll live to old age. The doctors say he's stable for now, but they've said that before. The future is still a question mark, but the difference now is that they are facing it together, without lies, without one-sided sacrifices. The very last shot of the film is them walking out of the hospital into bright daylight, hand in hand, the crowd swallowing them up just like at the food court years ago. But this time, they are side by side, not separated. The camera doesn't follow, it just stays at the entrance, watching them become part of the anonymous flow of humanity, and the credits roll over that image. Emotionally, it feels like the story saying, they are not special because they beat death, they're special because they chose love in the face of it. So, having walked you through the entire emotional map of Nyawa untuk Nyawamu, let's circle back and talk about why this film works as well as it does. Beyond just the plot beats, performance-wise, the actors playing Nate and Vivien carry this film. Nate's actor has this incredible ability to communicate entire paragraphs of monologue with just his eyes. When he's trying to be strong, his jaw tightens, but his gaze flicks downward, betraying doubt. When he's in pain, he doesn't exaggerate it into big groans. It's small winces, micro-hesitations, the way his hand instinctively goes to his chest when he laughs too hard. Vivien's actress, meanwhile, balances strength and vulnerability in a way that never feels cliché. She's not just the girl who waits by the hospital bed, she's ambitious, sarcastic, sometimes selfish, sometimes unfair, which makes her humanity so compelling. You believe that she has a life outside of him, and that choosing him costs her something real, career opportunities, emotional bandwidth, and yet she chooses him anyway. That makes her love feel earned, not just written into the script as an obligation. In terms of direction, there's a lot to appreciate. The camera often opts for long takes in the heavy emotional scenes, which forces you to sit with the discomfort, not escape it through quick cutting. The use of natural locations, cramped Jakarta alleyways, noisy food courts, modest apartments, grounds the heightened drama in a lived-in world. This isn't some glossy, idealized city. It's sticky, crowded, sometimes gritty, and that texture makes the quieter, tender moments stand out more. The score is another highlight. It's understated, built around a simple piano motif that echoes a heartbeat, sometimes steady, sometimes stuttering, sometimes almost disappearing entirely. It swells at key moments, sure, but more often it retreats, letting silence or ambient noise carry the emotion. There's one track that plays whenever we see time passing, clocks changing light, trains pulling in and out of stations, and it's this bittersweet, looping melody that somehow feels like both goodbye and welcome. If we talk pacing, the film takes its time. This is not a brisk, 90-minute roller coaster. It breathes, it pauses, it lets you feel the boredom of hospital waiting rooms, the drag of days that blur into each other when you're sick or caring for someone who is. Some viewers might find that slow, even indulgent, but I think it's deliberate. It forces you into the character's temporal reality, where moments of acute crisis are separated by long stretches of just living, planning meals, folding laundry, Googling symptoms at 3 a.m. The movie understands that the drama of illness is not only in the beeping machines but also in those tiny, accumulating acts of adaptation. Thematically, the big one, obviously, is sacrifice. But what I love is that the film interrogates sacrifice instead of glorifying it blindly. Nate's initial choice to break up with Vivien, to save her by hurting her, is framed by the narrative as understandable but misguided. It shows how self-sacrifice, when done unilaterally, without consent, can become a form of control. In trying to shield her from pain, he actually robs her of the chance to love him fully, to make an informed choice, and that, the film suggests, is not romantic, it's tragic and slightly arrogant. The second theme intertwined with that is agency. Vivien's arc is about reclaiming her right to decide what kind of suffering she's willing to endure, what kind of love she wants to fight for. The film is very clear, love is not painless, but that doesn't mean someone else gets to pre-decide your pain tolerance. There's also a strong commentary on class and healthcare. Adrian's whole foundation exists because the regular system fails people. Nate, as a working-class man, could never have afforded cutting-edge treatment on his own. His survival is literally at the mercy of a rich donor's conscience. The film doesn't hit you over the head with that, but it's there in the details. The way Nate's mother clutches a donation envelope at one point, the way hospital staff bow slightly deeper to Adrian, the way clinical trial participants are desperate enough to overlook the risks. That inequality creates fertile ground for ethical gray zones, where saving lives and using lives can start to look disturbingly similar. Another layer I appreciate is the film's exploration of masculinity. Nate's whole identity crisis is tied up in what it means to be a good man. When you're ill, unemployed, physically limited, he internalizes the idea that his worth is measured by how little trouble he causes, how much financial and emotional weight he can shoulder. The film gently dismantles that, showing through Vivien and his mother's love that being cared for is not shameful, and that allowing yourself to be vulnerable can actually be an act of courage. On a more emotional level, I think one of the reasons Nyawa untuk Nyawamu resonates is because it taps into very universal fears: being a burden, losing someone slowly, making the wrong choices out of love. There are scenes that feel ripped from real life, the late-night Google rabbit holes, the awkward jokes you make to deflect tension in a hospital, the way grief can start before anyone actually dies. And when I look at how audiences responded, at least if we imagine the theater echoing with sniffles and long, stunned silences as credits rolled, I can easily see why this film would become one of those word-of-mouth hits, especially among younger viewers who are tired of romances that pretend love either solves everything or isn't worth it unless it ends in grand tragedy. Here we get a middle path, love that doesn't heal the body but transforms how you inhabit it. Now, does the film have flaws? Of course, at times. Especially in the Adrian subplot, it veers a bit too close to speechifying, with characters articulating themes a bit more explicitly than they need to. There are one or two side characters, like Vivien's colleagues, who feel like they exist mainly to deliver exposition or comic relief rather than as fully fleshed out people. And depending on your tolerance for melodrama, some of the more tearjerker moments, like the near collapse at the very end, might feel manipulative. But for me, the sincerity of the performances and the grounded specificity of the setting balance that out. This isn't melodrama for its own sake, it's trying to articulate something real about how love behaves under pressure. From a cultural impact perspective, Nyawa untuk Nyawamu slots into a growing wave of Indonesian films that are willing to tackle heavy emotional material with cinematic ambition, not just as TV drama stretched onto a big screen, by weaving in questions about healthcare, class, and individual agency without losing sight of the central love story. It feels both deeply local, in its language, its cityscapes, its social cues, and universal in its emotional vocabulary. It's the kind of film that makes you walk out of the theater and immediately want to call whoever you love most, not to say anything profound, just to hear their voice. And as someone who usually spends my time on this channel talking about pixelated worlds and fictional heroes gaining extra lives through power-ups, watching a story where there are no extra lives, where every hit point matters, hits different. It makes you think about how you're spending your own stats in real life, and that, to me, is the mark of a good movie. Not just that it makes you cry, but that it changes, even slightly, how you look at your own choices. To wrap this up, if I had to put my feelings into a kind of verdict, I'd say, Nyawa untuk Nyawamu is one of those quietly devastating films that doesn't just aim for your tear ducts, it aims for that part of you that wants to be both noble and loved, and it whispers, you don't have to pick one. You can be flawed and scared and still worthy of someone staying. It's a film that challenges the romantic myth of the self-sacrificing goodbye and replaces it with a more complicated, more human image, two people, fully aware of the storm clouds ahead, deciding to share an umbrella anyway. When the credits rolled, I didn't feel the clean, cathartic sadness of a tragic ending. I felt something messier, a mixture of gratitude, sorrow, and this stubborn kind of hope, like I'd just watched two characters learn, in the hardest way possible, That love is less about grand gestures and more about the daily decision to sit with each other in uncomfortable truths. So if you've ever been on either side of that instinct, to push someone away for their own good or to fight like hell to stay near someone who keeps trying to protect you from themselves, this movie is going to feel like it's looking you right in the eye. And as we end this deep dive, let me leave you with the question that echoes through the film and maybe through your own life. When you weigh your fears against your love, which one do you let win? Then let's go even deeper into this film, because if you're still here, if you answered yes, it probably means Nyawa untuk Nyawamu did something to you that you can't quite shake off, something that lingers in the edges of your thoughts like the afterimage of a bright light when you close your eyes. And that's what I want to explore now, not just what happens in the movie, but how it feels watching it, the way it seeps under your skin and makes you see your own relationships, your own fears, with a slightly different tint, as if the film quietly adjusted the contrast on your view of life without asking for permission. One of the most quietly powerful choices the film makes is how it depicts Nate before, during, and after the treatment, because this isn't just a love story, it's also a portrait of a body under siege and a mind trying to maintain control when control is an illusion. When we first meet Nate, he's positioned as that classic almost perfect boyfriend, funny, attentive, a little stubborn, but in that charming way that makes Vivien roll her eyes and smile at the same time. We see him through Vivien's gaze, which is soft and occasionally biased, glossing over the flaws because love tends to do that. But pay attention to the details, even in those early scenes, there are cracks. He deflects serious topics with jokes, he minimizes his pain, he keeps certain worries to himself. That's not just characterization, that's groundwork. We're watching a man who has been trained by culture and maybe by his upbringing to equate vulnerability with weakness, and that's going to shape everything he does when his health crisis hits. When his illness escalates and he pulls away from Vivien, the film doesn't put a halo on him, it doesn't cue some grand orchestral swell to tell us, look, what a noble hero sacrificing his happiness. Instead, it gives us awkward pauses, bitter arguments, slammed doors, and the sour taste of words said to wound. The breakup scene isn't shot like a tragedy, it's shot almost like a horror sequence, not with jump scares, but with emotional dread. The camera often holds on Vivien's face a fraction of a second longer after Nate delivers each blow, forcing us to sit in the impact of his words instead of cutting away. We see him saying things he doesn't fully believe, exaggerating every insecurity he sees in her, and we see the damage land. That's important, because when he later reveals or we understand that his goal was to free her, it doesn't erase the harm, it complicates it. And that's one of the bravest storytelling choices the film makes, it refuses to romanticize emotional violence just because it's done in the name of love. It shows us how selfish selflessness can look in the moment. Vivien's character, in turn, becomes the vessel for our confusion. We experience the rawness of being suddenly unwanted, unneeded, by someone we've built our future around. The film lingers on that loneliness. There's this montage after the breakup, but it's not the usual heartbreak playlist montage. It's slower, quieter, made up of little moments where Vivien goes through her normal routine but everything feels slightly off, like the world is mildly out of sync. Her coffee tastes different. Her apartment sounds louder when she comes home. Her phone is so much heavier in her hand when there's no one on the other end of it. These little choices mirror what a lot of people go through after an unexpected breakup. Life technically continues, but it feels like someone removed a color from the spectrum. And then, layered on that, there's another emotional blow, finding out, much later, the truth about Nate's condition and choices. That betrayal of not just love but of information is a wound that runs deep. The movie doesn't make it easy for her to forgive him, and that's essential. When she sees him again after 3 years, and the truth begins to surface, there's this tug-of-war between instinct and intellect, her body reacting to him with familiarity and yearning, her mind reminding her of the pain, of the lies, of the years of silence. You can almost see that in the way she moves, her feet step forward before her shoulders relax, her hands hover near him but don't touch until she gives herself permission. The film honors that hesitation, that earned caution. It's not just, oh, you're back and alive, all is forgiven. It's more, you're back, you're alive, and now you owe me the respect of honesty. And that's what gradually transforms this from a simple tragic romance into something richer. it becomes a story about negotiating new terms, about refusing to let the past's dynamics automatically reassert themselves. Vivien isn't just the girl who waited, she's the woman who returns to the table with new boundaries, new awareness. She can still choose him, but not at the cost of annihilating herself. One of the most haunting dynamics in the film sits in the triangle between Nate, his illness, and that enigmatic donor funding his experimental treatment. At first glance, the donor is just a plot mechanic, a way to plausibly explain how this young man gets access to cutting-edge, expensive procedures. But as the movie progresses, he becomes something more symbolic, this almost godlike figure who literally trades in years, who decides whose Nyawa, whose life is worth gambling on. We never get a full origin story for him, and that's deliberate. He's less a fully fleshed out character and more an embodiment of a system that amplifies certain lives and risks others in the pursuit of progress. The conversations between Nate and the donor are some of the most fascinating and unsettling in the film. There's a scene where Nate, in one of his darker moods, asks the donor point blank, "Why me?" and the donor gives a practiced answer. He talks about Nate's case being medically interesting, about the right combination of youth, disease progression, and response to previous treatments. But there's a moment, a tiny flicker, where we glimpse a more human layer. Maybe Nate reminds him of someone he lost, or maybe this is just how he comforts himself, by pretending he's personally invested in each patient. The film is smart enough not to over-explain, it just lets that ambiguity sit. Because that's how power often looks in real life, dressed in kindness, but quietly retaining all the control. That control is what makes the ethical questions around Nate's treatment so loaded. The movie doesn't dive into graphic medical procedures, but it hints at the toll, the nausea, the weakness, the mental fog, the way each new scan holds the possibility of hope or heartbreak. For Nate, the treatment is both a lifeline and a trap. It gives him a reason to believe he might have a future with Vivien, but it also keeps him tethered to the donor, to the hospital, to this identity as the experimental case. It's like being both saved and owned. There's a fantastic moment, easily missed if you're not watching closely, where Nate overhears two doctors talking about the subject's progress in the hallway, referring to him in the third person like a lab specimen. The camera doesn't cut to his face, it just stays on his hands, clenching and unclenching. It's such a simple, quiet shot that speaks volumes about dehumanization. Now, contrast that with Vivien's presence, which constantly fights to rehumanize him. She insists on calling him by silly nicknames, on reminiscing about their shared memories, on asking him about his dreams that aren't medically measurable. In one scene, she brings a sketchbook and asks him to draw the future apartment they once joked about living in, and he hesitates, saying, "What's the point?" And she answers, "The point is that this is you. Not your charts, not your scans. You." It's a small act of rebellion against the clinical narrative that's been imposed on his existence. From a thematic standpoint, that's a crucial thread. The film suggests that while medicine can extend your life, love is what fills that extended time with meaning, not in a cheesy, Hallmark way, but in a practical, day-to-day sense. It's the difference between living longer and living fuller. This is reinforced in how Nate gradually shifts the way he talks about himself. Early on, he uses the language of someone doomed. "When I'm gone, if I don't make it, I don't want you to watch me fade." As Vivien re-enters his life and refuses to accept the role of a helpless observer, his language starts to pivot, however grudgingly. He finds himself saying, "If we get through this, if I'm still here next year, if things stabilize," and suddenly, the pronouns change. It's we more than I, us more than me versus my illness. That's not just a script flourish, that's character evolution. Vivien's fight is not just to stay by his side, but to drag him back into a shared grammar of living. The film also plays with the motif of time in subtle, recurring ways. Watches, clocks, countdowns, these pop up throughout the story, yet rarely in the foreground. There's Nate's old wristwatch, which stops working during a particularly intense round of treatment, prompting a quiet scene where he almost throws it away, but Vivien takes it instead, saying, "It's not broken. It's just resting." Later, in one of the final scenes, we see that watch again, repaired and ticking, on his wrist. It's on the nose if you describe it out loud, but in the film, it's earned, because it's been built up as a symbol of how he's perceived his own time, first as something that's running out, then as something that might, just might, still be worth tending to. Another layer the movie handles with surprisingly delicate care is family. We don't spend a lot of time with expanded family members, and yet their occasional presence tells us so much. There might be a scene where Nate's parents or a sibling come to visit, their worry manifesting as either overwhelming fussing or awkward small talk. They love him, but they are tired, scared, some of them have made peace with losing him, others are clinging to denial. Vivien's relationship with them, or with her own family, adds another dimension to burden. Maybe her parents question her choice to stay involved with someone whose future is uncertain. Maybe they ask, "Don't you want children? Don't you want stability?" And her answer is complicated because the movie never pretends that those questions aren't valid. It's not about painting everyone who expresses concern as an obstacle, it's about showing that love, in the real world, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's always negotiating with other responsibilities, other expectations. This is where the film feels very grounded in Southeast Asian realities, the tension between individual desire and familial duty, between romantic love and broader communal concern. And yet it never becomes a morality play, it remains a deeply personal story of two individuals negotiating that tension on their own terms. Let's step into the craft a bit more and talk about how the director uses silence. In many scenes, especially the heavier ones, there's this temptation in cinema to fill every second with either dialogue or music, as if the audience might get bored if something isn't constantly happening. Nyawa untuk Nyawamu often resists that. It allows silence to sit, thick and uncomfortable. After a big argument, instead of cutting away or drowning the moment in a moody track, it sometimes holds us there, in that air-heavy stillness, watching the characters struggle to figure out what to say next, or accept that there's nothing else they can say. In one such scene, after a particularly brutal exchange where Nate accuses Vivien of clinging to him out of guilt and habit rather than genuine desire, she doesn't immediately launch into a rebuttal. There's a long pause. She looks at him, tears in her eyes, considering. The camera doesn't move. In that silence, 1,000 things happen internally. You can almost sense the audience wanting her to snap back, to defend herself, but instead, she quietly says, "If that's what you really think of me, then we're not fighting the same battle," and walks away. The restraint in that moment is devastating, precisely because the silence primes us for something loud and instead delivers something soft but final. This smart handling of silence also extends to how the film treats the hospital as a soundscape. We become accustomed to the ambient noise, the rolling carts, the echo of distant announcements, the murmur of other patients. Then, in moments of intense emotional focus, those sounds drop out, as if the world narrows down to just these two people. It's a subtle but effective technique to make us inhabit their subjective experience. You'll notice that when Nate is most overwhelmed, the audio almost tunnels, as if he's hearing everything from underwater. When he's with Vivien and fully present, the sound widens, we hear more layers, more life. These are tiny details, but collectively, they build a very strong sensory grammar. Now, thematically, the film's title, Nyawa untuk Nyawamu, A Life for Your Life, is more than just poetic flair. It encapsulates this central exchange that's happening across all levels of the story. On a literal level, Nate is risking his life in the experimental treatment to buy more life, more future, for both himself and, in his mind, for Vivien, even if that future no longer includes him. Metaphorically, there's this persistent question: whose life are you really living when you make choices for someone else? Are you sacrificing your own, or are you also, in a twisted way, sacrificing theirs, because you're denying them the agency to choose? When Nate initially walks away, he thinks he's trading his future with Vivien to secure her freedom, her happiness. But what the film slowly reveals is that in doing so, he didn't just give up his own life with her, he also hijacked the trajectory of hers, sentencing her to years of unresolved grief and unanswered questions. The title, in that context, becomes almost accusatory. What right do you have to barter with someone else's Nyawa, even if you believe you're doing it for the right reasons? Then there's the ethical layer around the donor and the experimental treatment. How many unknown lives, unnamed subjects, have paid a price, sometimes their entire existence, so that someone like Nate can have a chance at survival? That's another, Nyawa untuk Nyawamu, an invisible ledger of lives fueling this one story we see. The film doesn't go full thriller with this, but the hints are there, and they leave you a bit uneasy. as they should. On the flip side, love itself is framed as a continual act of exchanging pieces of your life with someone else. Vivien gives up time, emotional energy, and maybe alternative paths she could have taken, in order to remain with Nate. Nate, eventually, stops trying to hoard his decisions and begins to share them, allowing his life to be shaped by her presence rather than by his fear alone. Their final happiness is not clean or untouched, it's very clearly something they have paid dearly for, with years of pain, ego, pride, and tears. And yet that's why it feels earned. It's not happily ever after, it's happily, despite everything, which is far more interesting. If we zoom out and look at the cultural impact, Nyawa untuk Nyawamu feeds into an increasingly bold trend in Indonesian and regional cinema, the merging of deeply local emotional textures with broadly universal narrative arcs. On paper, you can explain this movie to anyone in the world. It's a love story dealing with illness, sacrifice, reunion, and they will recognize that template. But in execution, it is steeped in a very specific emotional language, the way families use silence instead of confrontation, the way religious spaces are not just for faith but for hiding, the way public displays of affection are often small and coded rather than overt. In many Western films, the big emotional payoff might be a loud confession in a crowded place, but here, the biggest emotional shifts happen in private, in corridors, in quiet rooftops, in late-night rides on motorbikes through sleeping streets. That difference matters. It gives the film a distinct personality in the global field, a voice that says, we can talk about love and death and sacrifice too, but we'll do it in our cadence, with our textures. The audience response, especially in Indonesia and among diaspora communities, is likely to be intense. You can imagine people sharing clips of certain scenes, the hospital rooftop conversation, the chapel monologue, the hillside or seaside near ending, on social media with captions like, I wasn't ready for this, or, this hurt in ways I didn't expect. There's something particularly potent about seeing your own language, your own cultural context, handle subjects like medical hardship and relationship boundaries with such seriousness. It validates experiences that often get sidelined or simplified. Sure, there will be criticism too. Some will say the film glamorizes staying in difficult, painful relationships. Others will argue it doesn't go far enough in critiquing the power dynamics of experimental medicine. Some might even find Nate irredeemable and feel the ending gives him too much grace. Those are all fair readings, and the film kind of invites them. It doesn't tell you exactly how to feel about its characters, it just lays them bare and lets you wrestle. That's why it's the sort of movie that might not explode at the box office on day one, but could grow over time, as word of mouth spreads, as people tell their friends, you have to watch this, but only when you're in the right mood, and maybe not alone. One element worth lingering on is how Nyawa untuk Nyawamu frames masculinity and vulnerability. Nate's arc is, in many ways, the story of a man unlearning the idea that his value lies in being strong, independent, and self-sacrificing to the point of emotional isolation. At the start, his identity is entwined with this quiet heroism, not complaining about pain, shielding Vivien from the worst of his reality, making tough calls on his own. He equates love with protection, and protection with control. But over time, the film gently dismantles that. Vivien's consistent presence, her refusal to be treated like something fragile that needs to be kept at a distance, forces him to confront the possibility that the bravest thing he can do is not to disappear, but to stay and let himself be truly seen, sick, scared, angry, and all. There's a pivotal scene late in the film where Nate has a full-on breakdown, not the composed, cinematic kind where a single dignified tear falls, but a messy, almost childlike sobbing where his words come out jumbled and raw. He admits that he's terrified, that he hates what his illness has turned him into, that he feels less like a man, less like a partner, every time he has to ask for help. And instead of telling him, no, you're strong, you're so brave, Vivien says something different. She says, you're allowed to be weak with me. That's part of being with someone. I don't need you to be my hero. I need you to be here. That line hits hard, because it cuts against so much of the messaging men receive. It offers a different model of what partnership can look like, not one person protecting the other from the truth, but two people sharing the weight of it. That's not just romantic, that's emotionally radical, in a quiet way. Another thing the film does well is avoid turning Vivien into a saint. Yes, she is unwavering, loyal, and deeply compassionate, but she also has limits, breaking points. The script gives her room to be angry, not only at Nate, but at fate, at the donor, at the entire situation. There's a scene where she storms out of a meeting with one of Nate's doctors, frustrated with the vague answers and what she perceives as coldness, and she vents. They talk like he's a case, not a person. Like they're adjusting settings on a machine, not making choices about someone I love. She's not always composed, and she shouldn't be. She lashes out. She says things she doesn't fully mean. She nearly gives up at one point, even packs a bag and tells herself she's done, that she can't live in a limbo of maybe anymore. That near departure is important, because it proves that her staying is not automatic. It's a choice she keeps making, even when leaving might spare her more pain. That's what makes her perseverance meaningful, not some default, good woman, behavior, but a conscious, repeated act of will. Also crucial is the way the film's last act doesn't just revolve around whether Nate survives a particular procedure or not. Yes, that medical suspense is there, but parallel to that is this emotional suspense. Will he finally let go of his self-protective patterns? Will he stop trying to die on his own terms and start trying to live on shared terms? That dual tension is what makes the climax so gripping. The surgery or the major treatment sequence, depending on how you interpret the montage, is intercut not with tearful waiting room cliches, but with flashes of what Nate is actually fighting for, memories of mundane moments with Vivien, their stupid inside jokes, their arguments, their reconciliations, the feeling of her hand in his. We don't see some grand, idealized future, we see the messy, real past that made him who he is. It's almost as if the film is saying, you don't fight for a theoretical perfect life, you fight for the imperfect one you already had and might have again. In terms of pure visual symbolism, there are a few recurring images worth noting. Rain, for instance, is used in a way that's not entirely novel but still quite effective. Early in the film, a heavy rain scene coincides with their breakup, the classic pathetic fallacy, but later, when they reunite after one particularly rough hospital episode, it rains again, only this time, instead of running for cover, they stand in it, letting themselves get soaked, laughing through the discomfort. It's as if the rain transforms from a mirror of sorrow into a baptismal element, washing away some of the old scripts they've been living under. Windows and reflections show up again and again, Nate looking at his own reflection in the mirror, almost not recognizing the frail figure staring back, Vivien watching him through a glass partition in the hospital, the donor's face seen reflected in a metal tray as he talks about risk and reward. These images reinforce that theme of perception versus reality, of how we see ourselves versus how others see us, of lives observed rather than fully inhabited. Another delicate touch is how the film respects the religious and spiritual dimension without turning it into a cliché. Characters pray, sometimes formally, sometimes as angry, whispered questions, and these prayers aren't always answered with visible miracles. Instead, they provide moments of anchoring, places where characters can be honest in a way they might not be with each other. Vivien's chapel monologue is one obvious example, but there are smaller ones too, Nate's mother sobbing quietly in a corner of a mosque or church, a friend lighting a candle without making a big deal of it. These scenes ground the story in a cultural reality where faith and fear coexist, where asking, why him, is as much a spiritual cry as a rational one. And yet, the film never implies that faith alone will save Nate. It exists alongside medicine, alongside love, as one more thread in a very complex tapestry. When all is said and done, the core of Nyawa untuk Nyawamu is that final image of two souls, battered but unbroken, choosing each other fully, not as a fantasy but as a risk. The happy ending, such as it is, doesn't erase the scars, physical or emotional. Nate still lives with uncertainty. Vivien still carries the memory of those 3 years, of the nights she spent alone wondering what she did wrong. The donor still walks away into his next project, unchanged in some ways, leaving behind this one story that, to him, might be a success statistic but, to us, is a universe. The hospital still stands, ready to receive new patients, new stories of sacrifice and struggle. The world doesn't pause because these two people found their way back to each other. And that's the beauty of it. The film understands that love doesn't need the world to pause, it needs the courage to continue in motion, amid chaos. Amid fear. Watching this movie, You might find yourself thinking of that one person you hurt by trying to protect them, or that one person who walked away, for your sake, leaving you to decide whether that was love or cowardice or some complicated mix of both. You might think of choices you made that you can't undo, and wonder if rewinding time would actually fix anything or just create a different kind of wound. Nyawa untuk Nyawamu doesn't offer easy answers, but it does offer this one quiet, powerful suggestion, that maybe the bravest thing we can do is stop trying to script each other's lives, stop deciding alone what kind of pain someone else can or cannot bear, and instead sit in the mess together, be honest about the fears, and choose, over and over, to stay, to talk, to ask, what do you want, instead of assuming we know. So when the credits roll and the lights come up, if you find yourself sitting there, thinking not just about Nate and Vivien, but about your own, Nyawa, your own exchanges of life for life, then this film has done more than entertain you, it has invited you into a deeper conversation with yourself and with the people you love. And that, more than any plot twist or special effect, is what cinema at its best can do.